Good afternoon. I'm pleased to welcome you back. Our next session is entitled Human Rights and the Power of Principle in an Age of Drones, Gender Apartheid, and Aggressive War. I would like to welcome Dean Appleby back to the podium to introduce our speaker.
Our distinguished keynote speaker has been an influential voice in peace studies and human security studies, among other fields, for well over a decade. I know because I started to hear her name years ago, mentioned with respect and enthusiasm during my years as director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. I'm delighted to welcome her again to Notre Dame and for the first time to the Keough School. Charli Carpenter is a professor in the Department of Political Science and Legal Studies at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. Her teaching and research interests include the protection of civilians, laws of war, humanitarian affairs, humanitarian disarmament, global advocacy networks, political violence, and the role of pop culture in global security. Professor Carpenter also directs the Human Security Lab, an interdisciplinary community of researchers who address issues of violence and human rights abuses and economic, food, and climate security. Last month, she was in Europe presenting the lab's new survey research on the gender implications of Ukraine's martial law. She addressed the humanitarian impact of President Zelensky's travel ban on men ages 18 to 60. Last July, as part of the Human Security Lab's research into the refugee crisis in Ukraine, Dr. Carpenter and a team of graduate and undergraduate students collected a random survey of over 3,000 Ukrainian internet users and analyzed hundreds of open-ended comments about the travel ban on Ukrainian men and boys. They found fewer than half of Ukrainians support the law remaining in place, and even among those, many want to see changes in the rules on freedom of movement. The largest group of respondents provided a variety of arguments about alternatives to such a policy that could both align better with human rights, protect civilian families, and support the war effort. Professor Carpenter has published 3 books and numerous journal articles, among the latter, most recently, Manufacturing Complicity, How Survey Experiments Prime Americans for War Crimes, still forthcoming, I think, in Perspectives on Politics, or is it out? It's out. And The Stopping Power of Norms, Saturation Bombing in US Public Opinion on the Laws of War and International Security, and many other articles. Her 2014 Cornell University Press book, Lost Causes, Agenda Vetting and Global Issue Networks in the Shaping of Human Security, asks why some issues and threats, diseases, weapons, human rights abuses, vulnerable populations get more global policy attention than others. How do global activist networks decide the particular causes for which they advocate among the many problems in need of solutions? Carpenter argues that the answer lies in the politics of global issue networks themselves. Building on surveys, focus groups, and analyses of issue network websites, she concludes that network access has a direct relation to influence over how issues are ranked. Advocacy elites and non-governmental and transnational organizations judge candidate issues not just on their merit, but on how the issues connect to specific organizations, individuals, and other issues. Another of her books, Forgetting Children Born of War, Setting the Human Rights Agenda in Bosnia and Beyond, Colombia, 2010, analyzes an often overlooked dimension of the sexual violence and exploitation that occurs in many conflict zones, namely the plight of children born of such acts who face discrimination, stigma, and infanticide. Yet, Carpenter notes, the massive transnational network of organizations working to protect war-affected children has for 2 decades remained curiously silent on the needs of the vulnerable population. I hope it's not now over 3 decades. I'm focusing specifically on the case of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Professor Carpenter showed in this book that the social construction of rights claims is contingent upon the social construction of wrongs. According to Carpenter, this pathology prevents the full protection of children born of war. Professor Carpenter has held fellowships at the Peace Research Institute of Frankfurt, the Oakley Center at Williams College, and Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. She has served as a consultant for the United Nations, State Department, the Department of Defense, and the human rights NGO community. She is a bi-weekly columnist at World Politics Review and regularly contributes to foreign policy and foreign affairs. In addition to her teaching and research, she tells us on her website, Professor Carpenter spends her time parenting, traveling, arguing with concentration camp guards, kayaking, snowboarding, and rescuing spiders. Despite the temptation to ask her simply to elaborate on that personal statement, we are eager to hear instead her reflections on our forum theme with her talk entitled Human Rights and the Power of Principle in an Age of Drones, Gender Apartheid, and Aggressive War. Please join me in welcoming Professor Charli Carpenter.
Thank you. It's lovely. So is my mic on, or do I need to turn it on? Including if I step away? Very good. Oh, it's wonderful to be here. It's an honor, in fact, and a unique pleasure to return to Notre Dame and to speak at the Keough School. And I want to thank Dean Appleby for that lovely introduction, and also for inspiring my talk, because when he reached out to me and asked me to give this talk, he also gave me a topic or a very broad set of ideas. And he basically asked me to develop a talk on the politicization and instrumental use of rights, human rights. Whoops. Go back. I want you to see how he put it. And I also want to look for my glasses. Give me one moment. Oh, they're right here. He wanted me to, I was asked to address how strategic behavior, particularly that of the great powers, and normative values, particularly the idea of universal human rights, shape each other and interact. And in his correspondence to me, Dean Appleby wrote, optimists, as you know, hope that politicization will reinforce human rights as prominent standards of international legitimacy and will even nudge actors to improve their human rights behavior. But pessimists worry that politicizing human rights will make them appear as favoring one side, and this will undercut the legitimacy of the norms, or that these great power trade-offs and compromises will imperil the principles of human rights. So I guess I would say I'm in between these two. I'm both a pessimist and an optimist, a poptimist, if you will, which is to say that I would argue it's not the politicization and instrumentalization by great powers that reinforces or undermines human rights. And in fact, I see the way that the great powers trade in human rights talk and blame games and human rights currency shows the power of principle. But the legitimacy doesn't rise and fall on that, I don't think, because the purpose of human rights is to empower people, not states. It's to empower global civil society against states. So it is the integrity and impartiality of norm champions, not of great powers or even states at all, that in my mind matters the most in all this. And I was incredibly pleased to be invited here, not only because these are great questions you're asking at this conference, but also because I've been thinking a lot about this very question of the sort of the weaponization of human rights as part of an edited volume I recently contributed to. See, I've fallen behind in my slides already. That's likely to keep happening in this talk. Here we go. Dan Dresner, Abe Newman, and Henry Farrell put together this book on weaponized interdependence a couple of years ago when this was a big buzzword in Washington. And Dan very kindly asked me to write a chapter on human rights. And this is really a concept that comes out of economics and trade theory. But I did my best to apply it to human rights. And I made a few theoretical points in that chapter, which I'm going to touch on in my talk tonight. But I'm also going to build in a slightly different direction. So I'll just foreground them here. And one is that there's an interesting difference between the way liberal democracies get perceived when they violate human rights law and when dictatorships do even worse things. And I think that it's a sort of a double standard whereby the misbehavior of the US or the UK or Israel weighs more heavily on the human rights regime, or is said to do so, precisely because of the allegedly unique ideational interdependence that liberal democracies have with the concept of human rights and humanitarian norms. I don't buy this, by the way. This is an observation. I think, far from constraining liberal democracies, this actually empowers them in ways that are not good for human rights activists. It empowers them to engage in norm revisionism in ways that suit them. And that just leads to justifiable cries of hypocrisy when by dictatorships, Russia and China, for example, when they do the exact same thing and then get criticized by the West. This sense of hypocrisy, I think, is part of what has empowered and embittered Russia in its efforts to creatively justify war in Ukraine, for example. Where am I? I also think that none of this matters very much, in my view, because although, as I said, although states and especially great powers on both sides will attempt to weaponize human rights, and advocates may be particularly scared when liberal democracies do it, none of it very often works anyway. And that is because NGOs and norm champions are actually quite good at pushing back. And that's what matters. And so I want to build on this here to argue that this is actually a really good thing for human rights, because what it means is that the trick for these civil society-based norm champions, to which I'll return in closing, is just not to become ensnared in this push and pull. And politicization and instrumentalization by the great powers, one against the other, or fall prey to assuming that any particular state is more or less important to the overall stability of the principles of the universal human rights regime. Their job is just to consistently and unbiasedly espouse universal standards as best they can and apply them even-handedly to all sides and to all vulnerable populations, I should add. And since the universality of standards and some of the difficulties with that is where I'm going to end up, it's also where I'll begin with a few remarks about universalism in human rights, because this is, again, a discourse that's increasingly being challenged by China in particular right now at the Human Rights Council. And I'm going to basically offer 3 observations today and a challenge to the human rights global civil society community. And in the course of doing all this, I'll just draw on some themes. I foregrounded them in the title or the subtitle of my talk. Themes I often write about: drone warfare, the protection of civilians, gender. And I'll elevate and I'll amplify citizen voices from 2 places where they seem most often silent. One is Ukraine, where the first, as we all know, the first major aggressive land war in 70 years is underway, seemingly despite all the cherished principles of the UN Charter regime. And also Afghanistan, where the population is facing severe food insecurity, severe gender apartheid, and the threat of renewed civil war as well after decades of counterinsurgency. The research lab I direct at University of Massachusetts, oops, I'm already behind, Ukraine, Afghanistan, my research lab at University of Massachusetts. Well, we're analyzing surveys from civilians from both of these lands. And we're just finding that a consistent citizen commitment to the idea of human rights and a progressive notion, more progressive than you might imagine, of how that should be applied to both men and women is hearteningly salient, and even in these hard cases and unlikely contexts, or least likely contexts. allegedly least likely content. So we'll come back to that. I will just begin with observation number one, which is that the appeal of human rights is universal. And the best evidence in my mind is that ordinary beings in the least culturally Western places say so when you ask them. I have a daughter who's enrolled in a degree program in a European university. She studies cultural anthropology. She argues with her professors every week about human rights and cultural relativism, and this kid makes me so proud. She's in a discipline whose professional association once refused to acknowledge the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and who to this day has a bit of a ambivalent relationship to this regime, particularly arguing that states have no right to tell one another how to interpret human rights, an argument China would appreciate. Well, that's one perspective. I am often find myself sending my daughter scholarship by anthropologists like Sally Engel-Mary, and also political scientists like Lisa Alfredson at the University of Pittsburgh, and Peace Meady, who is, I think, at Bristol University now. Mary points out, and these books are all terrific if you're interested in gender violence in non-Western contexts. Mary's work, among other things, criticizes anthropologists for always looking at the South to find culture. And she says there's culture in transnational human rights networks as well that we need to understand. And that culture is one actually that resonates with rights activists all over the world. It's part of what enables them to be so successful. And Lisa Alfredson's great book shows how some of the most marginalized citizens in contexts like Bangladesh and Nigeria have not only rejected or challenged their cultural norms around things like female genital cutting, but also have been eager and successful at using human rights language to do so, and using human rights law and transnational advocacy networks to fight for things like access to asylum in Western countries. Peace Meady, former student of mine from Gispia at University of Pittsburgh, her great book, she's written a terrific book that shows how international norms on violence against women are being translated into local law in Africa. So all of these are just some examples, and I'll scatter more through my talk today of great scholarship out there. But these belie the idea that cultural elites should get to speak for everyone, or that human rights are seen as Western by all non-Westerners. It's just not the case. And it really depends on who you ask. And the people I like to ask are ordinary citizens when I travel and when I do survey research. So in Afghanistan, after the US withdrawal, I and some colleagues at the lab secured a National Science Foundation grant to conduct a survey in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. We fielded it through the internet very securely by hiding our survey inside dead web links, which meant we ended up with a random sample, not a sort of self-selected or snowball sample. But we were able to randomly reach the entire internet using population of Afghanistan. Now, that's only 26% of the country. But it's a more random sample than many survey samples that come out of a context like that, because it's very hard to access people, particularly women. At this time, it was not very safe for women to speak to outsiders. So we were able to do this very securely. We got really candid answers, and we asked citizens a rash of questions about the future of their country, peace, hunger, safety, security, governance, the Afghan reserves, and human rights as well. 26,000 Afghans answered our survey, and over 3,000 of them finished the entire survey, which had quite a lot of questions. There was great variation in their answers, and we're still beginning to analyze this data. We're swimming in. But I want to share some of the basic descriptive statistics with you, just on the question of whether human rights are important. And on that question, 70% of Afghans somewhat or strongly agreed with the statement. How is it worded? How much would you agree or disagree with the following sentence? I believe reducing human rights violations against any and all Afghans is important. Top priority for the future of my country. We asked them about other priorities as well, but 70% strongly agreed or agreed with this. And what surprised us even more is that at least as of last year when we collected this, over half the country, and this is a country on the brink of famine, it was already at that time, argued that the international community should actually maintain the sanctions, keep the reserves frozen until an inclusive government was established. I was astonished by this finding. I thought many people would prefer food security. But they really wanted, some Afghans really want this to be used as a lever. Some of the individuals in their open-ended comments literally call for Western military intervention to oust the Taliban. So there was also a tremendous consensus on women's human rights specifically, among men as well as women. Yes, that's the right slide. So 66% of Afghans as a whole agree or strongly agree with the proposition that women's human rights are a top priority for the future of the country. This is a gender inclusive finding. If you look, you can see both men and women agree with this statement, strongly agree with it in roughly the same numbers. Interestingly, women are more likely to strongly disagree. We don't know why yet. I have to look at the open-ended comments from this specific group. But so there's some variation here, but not a lot of variation there. And particularly, actually, there's one more thing I want to show you. We also asked what kinds of rights do you think are most important? We invited people to pick 3 off a list. So there's quite a lot of gender overlap on these as well. These black ones, you can see there's not much difference. In many cases, it's actually men that are more seized of women's human rights than the women even are themselves, at least on this survey. Education, political participation, healthcare, for example. Men say they feel even more strongly about this. The one area we were looking for gender gaps here in what women and men say are important for women. And the interesting one we found is a human right that actually the international community in the West is least interested in helping Afghan women achieve, which is the right to get the heck out of the country. And these are some of the open-ended comments you'll find. Because we asked people to explain themselves as well. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the last thing I want to say is we're also finding that this finding holds. People in Afghanistan think women's human rights are important, even if they support the Taliban. So we're comparing now concern for women's human rights on the vertical with support for the government on the horizontal. And if you look over, if you look over here, these are people who say they support the Taliban a lot. And still 40 something of them, I have my reading glasses on. A majority agree or strongly agree still with women's human rights. So this is interesting and perhaps not expected, and bears additional research, which we have underway. We didn't just ask people to click a button on a Likert scale. We also asked them to explain their answers. So we did a skip sequence where people who disagreed with women's human rights get to tell us what they think are a higher priority. People who are undecided get to tell us why. Many of them just say they're afraid to answer. But those who strongly agreed or agreed, who leaned toward agreeing with women's human rights, we asked, what does that look like for you in your own words? And we're going through this data and finding ways to analyze it. I'll just give you some sense of what's in there. A lot of Afghans list specific rights that matter to them. Some of them talk about how you can't really ask this question until the Taliban are out of power. Some talk about how women's human rights are good for everybody. They strengthen the entire society. They'll strengthen the economy. And some talk about rights sort of in an Islamic framework, which means different things to different people. But don't assume that that means that they're saying rights are Western. That's not what we're seeing in these open-ended comments, not all of them anyway. If you dig into them, this is just a frequency distribution of what kinds of themes we're seeing in some of these open-ended comments. People who talk about other rights that aren't on our list, these rights in an Islamic framework, some of the comments look like this. They're saying Islam also says women must be in school. These aren't Western rights. These aren't inconsistent. So I think this is all by way of just responding to this idea that human rights are merely a Western construct or merely a tool of the powerful or a tool for the powerful to play games with each other. I don't think so. And if this is the strategic use of rights, which it probably also is, I'll take it. These are strategies. This is talk that is used by individuals living through things many of us can't imagine. And if this is a culturally specific articulation of rights, then I think it can be interpreted as easily to support the idea that human rights are universal and flexible as it can to support elite claims that some rights don't matter in certain contexts. And those are invariably, usually, the claims of those in power, not the claims of the weak. So I'd rather listen to what people are saying. Can these standards be weaponized by elites, by great powers? Yes, of course they can. But to say this cynically, as if it's a pejorative, I think misses the point, which is that human rights talk is by definition a weapon. It's a weapon that can be appropriated by the powerful. But in my view, as an analyst, there's a great deal of evidence that it remains one that mostly serves the weak. The most helpful definition of rights, by the way, that I've encountered is Cliff Bob's definition of rights as means. Bob, my friend and colleague who's here in the audience, and I think we'll be speaking tomorrow. Bob says a right is the power of one entity to enforce a duty on another, and a rights claim is a demand for such a right. Neither rights claims nor rights are ends in themselves, but means of achieving something substantive. Be it an education for an Afghan daughter, or the ability of a Syrian or Ukrainian or Honduran to cross a checkpoint from danger to safety, or for the right for one's children to be able to play outside without fear that a sunny day will bring death by a drone strike. Now, of course, even claims that are codified in international law can be evaded, as my colleague Zoltan Buzas, also in the audience, has shown in his book, and they can be escaped through reservations, as my colleague Kelly Zvagbo has and her collaborators have analyzed. And they can be, and they certainly are, framed in ways that encode power dynamics. Jack Snyder's new book on this is really a must read. I think it's terrific. But none of that changes the fact that the world is still a better place for people because of these human rights standards. And if you believe otherwise, I recommend this other excellent book by the great Catherine Sikink. So if you're tempted to think, and I think a lot of us are, that human rights were just a Western creation imposed on the global South, I think it's important to know that if anything, countries in the global South originally wanted, and has often wanted, a more expansive notion of rights historically rather than a less expansive one. I recently encountered a great new piece in Third World Quarterly by a Yale postdoc, Katie Beale, that shows that the whole idea of human rights as something owed by a state to its people, rather than also something owed by wealthy states to their former colonies, reflects a perspective narrower, not broader, than developing countries wish at the time of framings. Other examples, one of the earliest and greatest human rights campaigns of all time, one we don't often teach about in our classes, but always should, began in the Belgian Congo. It was led by Congolese elites, appealing for the protection of their people against the colonizers. And when missionaries and freed slaves from the US traveled to the region, they were some of the earliest Norm entrepreneurs and boomerangers, naming and shaming King Leopold. You can read about that in Adam Hochschild's great history of this era. But there's other important innovations in human rights that are not Western, but were imposed actually. We think of them as Western now, only because the West has become so accustomed to following them that we forget originally the things like the immunity norm, the civilian immunity norm, as Giovanni Mantilla shows us in his book. These were originally imposed on the West against its will. The US and the UK didn't want these norms codified in binding law. And it happened in 1977, not because Western powers pushed for it or even wanted it, but because developing countries did against Western resistance. And the Soviet Union was happy at that time to exploit this issue and shame the West in multilateral forums by going along with the non-aligned bloc. So I'll come back to this later because it's a great example of how great powers can get ensnared into things they agree to in really productive, generative ways. Another great book I would recommend is by Ingvild Bode. She talks about the role of global public servants. And I think it's important to remember that a lot of norms that sometimes get framed as Western imperialism, like the responsibility to protect, were actually invented by Africans. For example, folks like Sudanese diplomat Francis Deng, he basically invented the responsibility to protect and also spearheaded the guiding principles on internal displacement. People like Boutros Ghali of Egypt as well invented the concept of human security. So we also sometimes overlook the fact that the concept of economic and social rights were championed originally in the Soviet bloc, but have become increasingly mainstreamed in the West. Here's a recent and interesting example, by the way, is that the state of Maine in the US has recently enshrined the right to food in its constitution. And it's sort of created a norm cascade across US state and municipal jurisdictions to, if nothing else, get food in schools. In the past, American school children have had to pay for their meals. But now there's a campaign following from some campaigning by international organizations to get countries to take the right to food more seriously. And this seems really small, but it's important when even the most resistant Western governments begin to view things like food, not just as a commodity, but also as a public good, as part of the school system, like buses and bathrooms, something to which everyday people are entitled. So these are claims and they're important. And what better evidence that they have power, I would say, than that the powerful attempt to use them against one another in rhetorical combat over who is best protecting them. So I'm optimistic about the politicization of human rights. I think they're meant to be political. They're meant to be weapons, weapons of the weak, and they work, but they are working in the context of myriad efforts to appropriate, abuse, and evade them, all the stuff that's being discussed at this conference. So let me talk about some ways in which rights do get weaponized by the powerful, and then I'll loop back to some thoughts on what rights champions can do to even better inoculate themselves against these forces, or what challenges they may be facing. So that leads to my second observation, observation number 2. Weaponization of human rights is what norm advocates make of it. Now, for the morning panel tomorrow, I understand Professor Bouzas has asked us to focus on politicization in a very specific way as double standards in human rights enforcement, calling out violations by some actors and not others. I think I'm going to think about weaponization in that way tomorrow, and in this talk even more broadly. But of course, to Dean Appleby's question and to that great panel theme, we see many examples of that very thing from the great powers. In fact, I'm sure we're going to primarily see that over the next month at the Human Rights Council. I think very few diplomats at the Human Rights Council will be too introspective about human rights. They will mostly be pointing fingers at each other. And why not? Everyone wants to point finger at someone else, at your adversaries, not your allies. But I want to argue it isn't, what matters isn't what powerful states do. It's how norm champions react to what states do. And I think sometimes those reactions can give a bit too much power to states, especially liberal democracies. I also think that on balance, great powers don't get away with this as much as they once did, because global civil society is actually pretty savvy to this and pretty good at dealing with it. So a little example, and we can time travel a little bit, back to January 2020, the before times, right? This was right before the pandemic hit. My son was a senior in high school that year. And we had no idea in January what was coming and how the global agenda was about to change. But something happened in that first week of January 2020 that for a moment had us seized with dread that the global agenda was going to be changed in a very different way, dominated by something even worse. We thought we might be witnessing the start of a major conventional war at that time, not between the Ukraine and Russia, but between the US and Iran. And the event that triggered this was the assassination, as you may remember, of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani by a US drone in retaliation for Iranian attacks on a US base in Iraq. Everyone feared at the time that this brinksmanship might spiral into World War III. Iran's military went on to high alert, such that it mistook a civilian airliner for an incoming US missile and shot it down, killing over 200, mostly Canadian and Ukrainian civilians. Now, here's what's interesting. What ended this crisis wasn't human rights being weaponized by states, it was people power. The bilateral crisis ended when the Iranians learned the government had lied about the incident. They learned about this from an NGO. And they turned out in protest. The Iranian government was accused by its own people of corruption, of deception, of willful negligence, also by human rights groups. The US faced accusations too. Different kinds of accusations, interestingly, in particular of undermining the international norm on assassination. Now, I want to use this story to highlight a couple of things. And one of them is that those accusing the US of undermining the norm, I think we're maybe giving the US more credit than it's due. The US wasn't undermining a norm. The US was violating a norm. The US has been violating norms against assassination and against extrajudicial execution of civilians without trial, of terror suspects without trial, for many years in its counterterrorism operations overseas. I think this is important because there's evidence that powerful states don't just violate norms when they feel like it while pointing the fingers. They also try to reinterpret norms to their liking to get away with their violations. And if we treat that as if they've succeeded, I think that gives them more power than we need to. But you can see examples of that. I mean, President Obama didn't just ramp up drone strikes after he took over from President Bush. He created an entire legal justification, sort of a narrative that this was not extrajudicial execution. This was something different. This was targeted killing, which I see as a term very similar to enhanced interrogations. It's a euphemism that directs attention away. And the US isn't the only country that does that, but we've done it a lot. So of course, his predecessor did that with enhanced interrogations. Oh, we don't torture people, President Bush would say. And he and his legal apparatus made repeated attempts to reframe the physical and psychological torture or abuse of detainees as something that fell short of torture. The Trump administration did this with respect to refugees, trying to redefine the fundamental rules of the refugee regime. Biden administration is quite disturbingly, as of this past week, following his lead, unfortunately. So I don't think any of these attempts to redefine norms make these any less norm violations. And as a poptimist, I look pessimistically and with disappointment at the role of my own leaders. But I also think these games only affirm the value of human rights as diplomatic currently, the intellectual gymnastics that leaders use to try to appear as if they're on the up and up. I think the risk to the human rights regime is more when human rights champions, especially civil society actors or intellectuals like me, start to act as if these actions actually change or threaten the meaning of norms, rather than threatening the standing of the actors that engage in them. I think we need to get clear. When states violate norms, it doesn't mean they're undermining the norm. That's a country undermining its own self, its own image, its own moral standing by violating a norm. And so I don't agree so much with scholars who make arguments or use language implying that these things, especially when the US or when liberal democracies do it, is so threatening to the norms of the regime. I think that's true to the extent we let it be true. I think I fear norm advocates and norm scholars may actually do more harm than good when we reify that. I don't think it's necessarily any truer that the US can redefine human rights norms any more than China can, though both will try. China is trying. China is promoting a vision of human rights in Africa, for example, that invites ruling elites there to view civil and political rights as expendable. And this is reflected in its diplomacy and its establishment of human rights forums in Beijing and fielding of UN resolutions. Russia, of course, has been using claims about the R2P doctrine and the rights of ethnic minorities as a lever, not as long ago as 2008 in Georgia and still again in Ukraine. But these strategies don't really work, actually. Nobody buys Russia's efforts to redefine R2P. If anything, Russia's war of aggression has shored up the relevance of the UN Charter rules and the Geneva Conventions in the eyes of the international community. China's efforts to reframe human rights hasn't shielded China from opprobrium for its treatment of the Uyghurs. Perhaps China can prevent a vote passing at the Human Rights Council to talk about it, but they can't prevent the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights from writing a report, and they can't prevent their own people from coming out on the streets or NGOs from speaking up. Neither Russia nor China was able to prevent progress forward last year on a new draft treaty on crimes against humanity. And as political scientist Jamal Barnes shows in this great book, everybody should read, the US didn't get to redefine torture. Nobody bought it. US obstructionism also didn't stall nor significantly shape the power of the International Criminal Court. If anything, the reverse had happened. The court grew and developed power in the face of US opposition. The existence of the ICC, Una Hathaway argues in the Post, is reshaping US's sense of the value of these institutions now, that we want to go after Russia, perhaps. But even if we don't think the ICC matters, it doesn't matter. The court doesn't need the US, as Adam Bauer shows in another great book I encourage you all to read, Norms Without the Great Powers, and Margarita Petrova's great research on in the humanitarian disarmament area. She shows how norms like the cluster munitions norm, the new nuclear ban treaty, etc., some of these norms and institutions succeed and take root actually because of great power opposition, not despite it. So this is what happens when global civil society in alliance with middle powers refuse to allow great power behavior to dictate the content of norms. I think that's very exciting. And throughout the past decade, we've seen so many examples of it: non-state human rights, intellectuals, citizens, NGO elites, lawyers, often using courts, not primarily state diplomats naming and shaming in multilateral forums like the Human Rights Council, but it's these ordinary people that have served as the key defenders and promoters of human rights claims and illuminators of poor behavior. What's my next slide? Let's have a look. Yes, it's the amnesty slide. I wanted to mention that it was small groups have taken on the great powers. It was NGO Human Rights Watch, to whom Ian Fishback leaked information about the Abu Ghraib detainee abuse. It was networks of think tanks and investigative journalists and NGOs that documented the hidden civilian casualty rates from drone warfare. And let's not forget, it was forensic investigators at Bellingcat who figured out that Iran shot down that airliner. And the anger from this incident moved two nations away from war, but it also empowered and incensed the Iranian people in ways that laid a foundation for the later protests that rocked Iran last year and set an example for protest movements in China and elsewhere. And all of this adds up. Since the Soleimani killing, the use of drones for assassination, by the way, is down. And even though progress is slow and never sufficient, one of Biden's first decisions upon entering office was to scale back his predecessor's use of drones for extrajudicial execution. So that leads me to my third and final observation. A pop culture reference there, some of you may get. Resistance is not futile, but it's still tricky. And I don't want to be blasé, so I want to dwell a little bit on what can human rights champions do if they want to maximize their own power and effectiveness in the face of ongoing attempted weaponization and contestation of human rights by both liberal democracies and autocracies? And I think this dialectic, this dilemma, is very much top of mind among human rights activists and advocates with whom I'm in touch. And I would just have a couple of thoughts. One is that one answer is simple. It's the one I've already given, which is that we can treat norm violations as if they undermine the violator and not the regime. But I think we should also, it's also important to give equal, to the extent possible, equal conspicuous attention to the human rights mistakes of those with whom we sympathize, as well as those who we view with opprobrium, and those whom we see as expedient victims, as well as those victims who aren't, and those rights that are most resonant culturally with us and those that are less so. And this is really hard. And for many reasons, but one of them being the reason Dean Appleby flagged in his correspondence with me, which is the fear among human rights advocates that one's criticisms will be weaponized. I'm even feeling that fear a little bit myself right now, which is why I'm going to talk a little bit about that Ukraine data, but I'm going to begin by, before I share that highly unpopular example from the Eastern European theater, I just want to emphasize there is absolutely no question that Russia is the aggressor in this war. And there's no question whatsoever that Russia is engaged in the vast majority of jus in bello violations, violations of the laws and customs of how you conduct a war, as well as the bigger crime of having resorted to war in the first place in violation of the UN Charter. They're in a position to commit worse abuses because they're on Ukrainian territory. And moreover, they are adopting willful and indiscriminate methods. So it makes perfect sense that as the Human Rights Council meets this week, Russian violations in that war take center stage. But it must also be said, and it's too rarely pointed out, that in response to the invasion, Ukraine, like many countries facing a national security crisis, including my own in the past, has departed from its obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in some respects. And this is just an observation that it's interesting there's much less discussion of that in the Western human rights community or among Ukraine's allies. And so I'll just give you one example. Behind on my slides again. Here we go. This is the example, and Dean Appleby helpfully flagged this in his introduction. As many of you know, even if you haven't read my writings on this, that when Russia illegally invaded Ukraine, one of the first things President Zelensky did, which any leader might do in an existential crisis, was declare martial law. And among the rules in that martial law was a ban on all men 18 to 60 from leaving the country, presumably in the event that they might need to be mobilized. Of course, this has led to some heartbreaking situations for families, men and their families. Now, to be sure, Zelensky suspended civilian men's right to freedom of movement in exactly the way civilized countries do, which is he filed a derogation with the United Nations. And also, to be fair, freedom of movement actually is a right that you can derogate from. It's not like torture or arbitrary killings if there's a national security emergency. But there are rules on derogations, and you can only derogate if it's strictly necessary, and also if it's done in a way, not in a manner that violates other important human rights norms like rules against gender discrimination. So this is just some of the plain language from the ICCPR. Now, people often say to me if I'm engaged in dialogue on this, well, don't nations have a right to conscript their citizens? Well, yes, both men and women can be conscripted, and then they become soldiers. Now they're not civilians anymore. But the vast majority of these men affected by this travel ban have not been conscripted, nor trained, nor mobilized, because they're not needed. The Ukraine actually has nearly 1 million reservists and hasn't run out of, they're turning away volunteers still, foreign and domestic. These men are still civilians. They're not being trained. They are being asked to sit in a shooting war as civilians under heavy bombardment, separated from their loved ones, many of them without jobs, at particular risk, by the way, of sex-selective massacre, like we saw at Srebrenica in Bosnia, and we saw at Bucha earlier in the war. something men are very vulnerable to in war if they are not armed and part of the fighting. So civilians, they are entitled to flee and seek asylum and to non-adverse distinction on the basis of sex under the Geneva Convention. So this is arguably inconsistent with the plain language of the ICCPR, and it also affects civilians' family rights under the Geneva Convention to remain together, not to be separated in time of war. And I would say this is not just a men's issue. This affects families too, children and women as well. I want to share a little story from last spring, early in the war. On spring break, I traveled to the Ukrainian border and assisted with the relief effort. And I basically was greeting refugees at the border and transporting them where they needed to go, mostly to train stations. The women I spoke to there were leaving the war. They were primarily focused on safety in flight. One of the young women I met was 9 months pregnant. This is her pink suitcase in my van. She was hoping to give birth in safety, but she was terrified to accept a ride from me in the first place because she didn't know if I was a human trafficker. She feared sexual violence and trafficking, traveling alone without her husband because he couldn't leave the country. I eventually persuaded her that she could come with me. And we became friends. She had pretty good English, so we spoke a good bit. What stayed with me was that she had also left her 4-year-old son in the country because she didn't feel she could handle traveling 9 months pregnant and with a little boy without her husband. So the fact that the father was unable to flee meant not only that the mother feared for her safety, but that the little boy had to stay in the war zone. I helped her get on a train to Amsterdam. We stayed in touch. She spent months after the baby was born trying to figure out how to get her husband and son out of the country. They tried every loophole in this law, but to no avail. So finally, she reached out to me again, asking for a ride, this time back into the war zone. And I can't tell you how strange that seemed. We had helped her get out, and now my network of couriers and volunteers was being asked to drive her back into the war zone to be united with her husband and son. They spent some months in Keough last summer. This is baby Vlada with her mother's permission, about 6 months old, a photo of the family on a good day last summer. But on bad days, this woman would text me describing rockets flying overhead and her deep fear that they would be firebombed if they went to the market. I first heard about the Venezia firebombing from a text that I received from her before the news broke here. The family struggled economically like many. And eventually, because winter came and the children were so cold, the mother gave up and took both kids back across the border to Europe, leaving daddy behind. So this is just one family, but this is a microcosm of what's happening all over the war. Now, citizens in Ukraine have used human rights language and arguments to push back on this. There have been quite a number of petitions, hundreds of thousands of people have signed them, but they haven't received much support or acknowledgement internationally. And if you want to know what the activists say, read the comments in these petitions. They're quite striking. Some Ukrainians have also challenged the law in the courts and written to the UNHCR. But at my research lab, what we wanted to know was what the wider population thought about this and really how they were balancing the humanitarian dimensions of this law with the strategic dimensions. It's helpful to me because I'm probably running low on time that Dean Appleby already told you a little bit about the research methods we used. It was again one of these random surveys. We asked Ukrainians a single question. I had this whole research team where we were looking at this and tracking this issue at my lab. This is the question we asked them, just whether they believed civilian men should be permitted to flee the war, required to stay, as is currently the law, or whether they had a different view on the topic. So here's what we found. We also asked respondents to explain their answer in their words. So those students helped me analyze that. I'll just show you a tag cloud quickly of some themes we found in that text. And one of the things that's striking is it's not a very polarizing issue. Yeah, there's a big, people do answer the question differently. Their comments reflect differences in which answer they picked. So these are the opponents of the law. These are the ones that are okay with it. But there's just a lot of overlap with these in the discourses in those two groups and the people who say they have a different view. Citizens across the country are really interested in thinking of alternatives to this law. So these are some of the examples of comments that ended up in a bucket like policy alternatives. One of the policy alternatives many citizens described was, let them go to Europe and work, call them back when you're ready to train them. And people will come back. I mean, most of these people are not war resistors, they're patriots, but they want to help in some other way. Opponents of the law, of course, made human rights arguments, some gender equality arguments, but also a lot of really practical arguments about how allowing men out will not only be good for the families, but good for the war effort. They can work, they can send money home, etc. And perhaps if they aren't trained anyway, they're not going to be helpful, perhaps even dangerous in the army. It's also noteworthy that the people who support this law, if you read the comments, they're not mostly saying they support the law, they're saying they support following whatever law Zelensky sets down. So a lot of this is not actually support for the martial law, but those who do support it also, there's a lot of qualifiers. Many people, even in that bucket, talk about how this is a very broad brush and possibly unnecessary. So I just want to conclude by a couple of things. I think what's interesting here across all these groups is the emphasis on practical and strategic reasons for changing things. They're saying that a human rights-based policy would also be a policy that is most strategic in this war, that the strongest army is a volunteer army, that untrained or unwilling recruits are unhelpful, even dangerous. They point out men can help in other ways, be called back later. And they talk about maintaining freedom as a form of morale, freedom and human rights as sort of constitutive elements of this war's very purpose. So that's interesting. And to me, as a scholar of the human security policy networks, the interesting question is why the human rights and civilian protection community have been so quiet on this. My research team hasn't identified a single major human rights organization that has openly stated that the right to flee a conflict zone can't be abridged on the basis of gender, or that the separation of families is a civilian protection issue, which is not to say that they haven't. I think a lot of human rights activism goes on through back channels. But when I talk to advocacy elites, I see them grappling with a threefold paradox in human rights impartiality, which is it's not just about are we shaming perpetrators on all sides? It's all about which populations do we give attention to and which issues do we give attention to? And from my conversations with them thus far, not any systematic research, by the way, just conversations, I'm inferring that something is going on here very similar to what went on in some of the issues that I studied in my book, Lost Causes. For some, there's just a genuine confusion about whether gender discrimination applies when it's men. Whether the issue is conscription or civilian protection. I mean, these are different communities of practice, so it depends how you frame it. Strategic questions about whether, even if they think that, what does the public think? Is this a framework that will play well with media, donors, advocacy targets? So we intuitively see civilians when we see women and children, and we see conscripts when we see men. We recognize gender apartheid when Afghan women are denied the right to leave the house, but not when Ukrainian men are denied the right to leave the country. So human rights is not always impartially applied among populations. And this is just an area where there's more work to do. I think there's also something about the way international law is set up that matters. In armed conflict, we're just likelier to focus on the laws of war, how combatants treat one another's people, than on how either country is treating their own citizens. So this is an issue that implicates both sets of rules, really, in a way. So if organizations are incentivized to look the other way, what this means is they can argue about what kind of problem it is, and they can pass the buck to someone else. They can decide it doesn't fall in their lane. And these are points I made in my book, Lost Causes, about why some issues can fall through the cracks. So what is contributing to that incentivization to look the other way on this? Well, again, these are just my hunches and inferences from what I've heard so far, but I think there's a genuine fear of being seen to pick on the underdog in an unjust, unfair fight. So there are politically acceptable perpetrators and there are politically acceptable victims. No one wants to be the first to call out Ukraine on the anniversary of the war a war in which they've mustered a really inspiring defense, even if it is in their strategic interest, and even if it is in the interest of human rights. I don't think anyone wants to experience what Amnesty International experienced last fall when they criticized Ukraine for housing soldiers too close to civilian targets. You can argue about whether or not they got it wrong. You can argue about whether they got it wrong or whether this is more important, more or less, or as important as all the terrible things Russia's doing. But whether or not they got it wrong, the consequence was a flurry of negative media attention, resignations by their Ukrainian employees, and outrage by the Ukrainian government. Now, it's not that NGOs can't take the heat. They do all the time. They're used to it. They're used to calling out the good guys and the bad guys and being annoying towards all sides, just as they should. We saw that in the earlier examples I gave you. The deeper problem here, I think, is that rights advocates may fear that Russia is going to weaponize any criticism of Ukraine, which is what happened in this instance. Russia pointed to Amnesty's reporting to claim that civilian deaths were Ukrainians' fault, not Russia's, to provide themselves cover. Not that that works. Nobody buys it, but they'll do it. And the last thing Amnesty would want is to allow that. So this practice, the problem is this practice provides Ukrainians cover as well. And again, it undermines the space for human rights conversations that should be happening on all sides. I'm not saying that's right. Again, this kind of weaponization is what norm advocates make of it. We can let that stand in our way of impartiality or not. But these are some of the reasons I hear NGOs give when they talk about how difficult it is to point fingers at a small country defending itself against an aggressive war in which such terrible things are happening. And there are other reasons as well. We can discuss more in depth on tomorrow's panel because I'm going to wrap up now. But my challenge to human rights advocates is how to deal in such a situation. How can you maintain that space to advocate in an even-handed way for a balanced discourse? Now, I'm not an advocate. I'm an analyst, so it's easy for me to talk. But analytically, I think that it's vital to find a way to do that, even when strategic concerns get in the way. Because if credible, professional, neutral human rights NGOs fail to call out both sides in an even-handed way, then what does that mean? That means Ukrainian abuses are only going to be pointed out by Russian propagandists, and only by the anti-war movement, or only by those unskilled in framing them in a way that avoids co-optation to the greatest extent, etc. And it can contribute to the appearance that human rights are just weaponized and politicized, and that would play into Russian hands, that would play into Chinese hands, that would undermine, that would indeed allow the undermining of the entire human rights enterprise, and it wouldn't help those fighting for rights in Afghanistan or Nigeria or China. So my overall point is that when we think about the human rights system, we could afford as scholars, I think, and as practitioners to fixate less on the fact that states use human rights language for their own ends. Of course they do. And think more about the moral responsibility and political capacity of civil society organizations to avoid being caught in those politicizations. Scholars like me should be, and I am now more than I used to, should be considering what kind of research questions we can ask that would provide an evidence base to support civil society organizations and NGOs in making those hard choices. But the thinking has to start also by refusing to underestimate human rights advocates' own power relative to great nations. And that just means that human rights activists, especially the more powerful of the professional NGOs, carrying that banner and engaged in defining what rights are, must just be conscious and mindful of their own power and use it wisely. So I think I'm over my time. I'll save the rest of my slides in case they happen to come up in Q&A, and I will just look forward to continuing the conversation in Q&A and on the panel tomorrow. But that's my optimistic message for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. That was brilliant. So many questions I have. Ulfa and I will circulate to as questions come forward. And we have one over here.
And I would love to hear people's names if you'll introduce yourself.
Oh, hi, I'm Anivesh. I'm a JSD, a PhD in law student.
Okay.
Previously, I worked for the International Criminal Court. So my question is personal, not like nothing related or the opinions of my ex-employer. But you mentioned that the ICC does not need these great powers. But the problem that I feel lies, especially in two instances that I'll highlight. The one situation in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the investigation against the UK was dropped when UK sort of challenged to reduce the funding to the ICC. And with regards to Afghanistan, there were sanctions against the ICC employees. So in that regards, like, I mean, it's correct that ICC is still able to operate, but it's still not able to hold these great powers accountable. So with that respect, do you still, is that not undermining of these systems in that respect? Because I mean, there's a sort of like ignorance of the violations by these great powers. And just a second ancillary question, not ancillary, but related. So you also mentioned that law of war does not govern the how states should behave towards its own citizens. So my question is that, is human rights law not supposed to govern that, and there's like crimes against humanity and other aspects which look into it, or should IHL also look at it? These two questions. Thank you.
Great questions. I'd love to talk with you more after about the ICC. Maybe we can mingle at the reception. I would say, I'm just going to stick by my argument for now, although you also have really important points, and say that I think the US undermines its own moral standing more than it undermines the ICC when it acts like that. And the US has tried in many ways to undermine the International Criminal Court. It's a flawed court. It is a political creature in some respects, but it also is an incredible innovation. And the framers of the court decided not to water it down on the basis of US desires. And so I think that there's more there than the US would like. And I think that over time, we've seen the US begin to turn toward, certainly when there's a democratic administration in office, there's much more cooperation toward the court. And I would anticipate that increasing over time, particularly now that it's becoming clear how useful such a court would be. Well, history will decide. On your other question, I think you're asking about what's the applicable law in armed conflicts. So human rights law still applies. Some of human rights law can be derogated from, but there's even there, as I pointed out, very specific rules. I think what's interesting is that we just pay less attention to it once there's a war on, because we think that we suddenly have a war crimes frame. But the laws of war, humanitarian law, and the Hague Conventions, they regulate primarily what combatants do to the enemy or how you treat foreign detainees. So it doesn't, there's nothing in the laws of war about making sure that your troops don't sexually abuse one another. There's all kinds of things where states have a responsibility for violations of human rights that can become exacerbated in wartime. And I think because these areas of the law are compartmentalized, sometimes those fall through the cracks, except for the widespread and systematic kinds of crimes, the crimes against humanity, which are covered. And I think we'll see more attention toward those now that that concept is going to be codified into an actual treaty. Perhaps that treaty making process will be a place to think more about this question, but perhaps not, because the very concept of crimes against humanity is it has to be widespread and systematic. So I think perhaps what will fall through the cracks is run-of-the-mill human rights violations that become more prevalent in wartime. I don't know. It's an interesting dissertation topic, perhaps.
Thank you, Professor Carpenter, for your brilliant presentation. My name is Nazari Stecek. I am visiting fellow at Keough Institute, actually from Ukraine. And I want to make, if you allow, one comment on your part of the lecture of general ban for male to leave country, and maybe some question about legal assessment of that prohibition. Thank you for raising this question, because it is, and it was maybe my personal issue, because I leave my country during wartime, and it took me a lot of time, efforts to
legally resolve this issue. My university, for Lviv University, actually was addressing Ministry of Education. Then Ministry of Education was addressing border guard service. Actually, in my case, I can and finally I leave my country. But there is other issue relates to students' males to leave a country. And I am not in favor of this general ban because I am confident that it should be more differentiated or discriminated. But in case of students, there was interesting development because during one period of time, our government allowed actually male students to leave country. But after that, there was a lot of abuse of this procedure. Why? For example, at the border, there were males of actually 45 years, 50 years with false ID student cards leaving country. And when these cases were arising, that government decided to provide general ban. And I agree that, and actually there are, I think, two reasons for that. It's, of course, national security issues, and of course, so-called corruption issues in Ukraine. And second point is about legal assessment. As you mentioned, Ukraine made a derogation from the UN Covenant on Political and Civil Rights. And meanwhile, Ukraine is also a part of European Convention on Human Rights, and there is also Protocol 4, Article 2 about the right to leave a country. And as you mentioned, there is this test that it should be prescribed by law, it should be necessary and proportionate to the aim. And I think that European Court of Human Rights will be actually deal with these cases, because after the exhaustion of national remedies, it will reach the court. And I think European Court of Human Rights will be complicated then to decide this case, because actually proportionate test is very political one for my opinion. And I think, and it will be interesting how court will decide this case. And actually, my question is, sorry for so a lot of statements. Actually, what do you think, if you apply this proportional test, how do you think our Ukrainian government argument about national security will prevail, or of human rights to leave country will prevail? Thank you.
What a great, rich question. I'm glad you were able to make it out. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't predict that. I actually don't know the European Convention language as well as I know the ICCPR, so I would want to look at it before even trying to guess. But I would say, I think you're right. I know that there are some cases going through the Ukrainian court system now, and they have to exhaust that first. But it's interesting that I read something from the European Court of Human Rights stating that it had suspended all cases against Ukraine, which Ukraine was the respondent, because of the war. So my first question is, are they going to hear this case? Or is there some kind of a exception that's being made due to the exigency, which is not a Ukrainian exception, it is a European court exception. And I was very surprised when I saw that. I didn't know that there was any such power on the court to just suspend the ability of right. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a number of questions there from a legal perspective, and I would need to know more about how that court is currently operating and orienting toward Ukraine in order to be able to predict anything. I think it'll be a fascinating test case. And I'm looking forward to staying in touch with you, since you seem to have some insight into it that will help me as I think more about these matters.
There you go. Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Sierra. I'm a master's student here in global affairs studying international peace. And my question was actually about your online survey with the people of Afghanistan on human rights. I'm really curious what your expected analytical process will be in terms of when we think of conflict zones, that accessibility to the internet, the time, the literacy level, the language, and possibly any interference with Taliban sympathizers. So I'm curious what the control groups will be and what your expected process is.
Okay, and we can also talk more after. We've already finished data collection. So right now we're analyzing, I don't know if your question is actually about how we gathered the data or how we're going to analyze it. Yeah, so there are some experiments built into the survey on specific things. So for there, the control groups, it's much like you would do survey experiments anywhere. You've just got treatment groups and then you've got a base group of people who don't get the treatment. We picked the methodology for data collection that we did in part because it seemed like the most secure way to access the widest majority of Afghans at that time in a random or representative way, because so many of the samples that I saw coming out of Afghanistan were they were snowball samples, really. They were very, they weren't representative. And those organizations that were doing really good representative survey work, like Asia Foundation, had to flee the country due to staff security. They evacuated everybody. So before we launched the survey, we spoke with the consulting firm that we worked with and determined things like, okay, if a young woman is filling this out on her phone and her father walks into the room, can she immediately hide it? And so there were mechanisms to make sure that people could do this clandestinely. You weren't going to be doing it on the phone where anybody could overhear. And I think it worked well because many people were very, very candid. Not all, not everybody. We also gave people the opportunity to skip questions and skip typing anything if they wanted to just move through more quickly. But those people who did take the time to write down their thoughts expressed really candid perspectives, many of them. And I think it's really interesting data. The survey was done in Dari and Pashto. We translated it. And now we're working in teams to code it using math to figure out if we've got a reliable code book. And it's a long process. We won't be ready to publish much more about our results for a while. But I think it was heartening to us to see how widespread and salient the concept of human rights and the concept of women's human rights was in this context. And I think it's going to be really interesting to dig into the data from Taliban supporters, and especially men and fathers who are Taliban aligned, but who answered these questions about the future they want to see for their daughters. I think it's going to be really fascinating.
I think what we should do at this point is collect two more questions, one from Irena and one from Cliff here.
Thank you for your lecture. My name is Irena. I'm MGA first year, and I wanted to ask a question. I'm from Ukraine. I wanted to ask a question related to Ukraine. Okay. I do agree with your point that this is a gendered issue, specifically in Ukraine, that men are not allowed to leave the country. But from my personal knowledge, this issue goes the other way also. Like, women were not registered in army and soldier positions. They were registered as cooks, as medics, even though they were fighting in the front lines as soldiers. And this became resolved only like a couple of years ago, or even this year. And so what I got from your lecture is that this is mostly a Ukrainian state abusing the rights of men. So this is the gender violation of rights in Ukraine. However, don't you think that this is a more of a social cultural issue of deeper gender divide of the country that is young and that has big, Soviet heritage and religious heritage? And also the second question is, don't you think that this is a more global and universal issue, since a lot of other countries across both Soviet bloc and around the world have only men constitutionally drafting them to army and are not drafting women? So how would you approach this, in a more universal way? Thank you.
These are great questions. These are also very useful questions in terms of advocacy strategies by which human rights organizations can potentially start tackling issues like this wherever they may be found, without it only being that they're pointing the finger at Ukraine. You're absolutely right. Even the United States, my daughter won't have to register with the Selective Service. My son does. I would be opposed to that in the same way on human rights grounds. It seems to me that there are many ways you could conduct a gender neutral conscription policy that perhaps keeps young women back who don't have kids, but allows fathers out with their families. You can just imagine many different scenarios if we get past this gendered war script that always kicks in when you're in an existential crisis. And it resonates with many audiences. And I think that's part of what makes it difficult. And yes, it's absolutely also intertwined with the rights that women do or don't have in war and in peace. So it's all connected, very much so. One of the things that inspired me and still inspires me about Ukraine is that even though, as with all countries, including my own, there are conservative elements, the Ukrainian policy has been to lean towards Europe and lean towards democracy and lean towards adherence to human rights. And I thought it was very inspiring at the start of the war in particular, that Zelensky went through a lot of motions on human rights and on conspicuously upholding the Geneva Conventions. I think it was part of his power and his moral authority that he went into this war with. I think that he used it in a really strategic way, but also in a really inspiring way that reflected in many respects the sentiment in the wider population. But of course, we know that in time of war, in almost every country, gendered norms get hardened. They tend to get more hardened rather than less. One of the things that I found so interesting in the survey data, I really expected to see much more widespread gendered language than I did. Like even, we're not looking at the tag cloud now, but that duty to defend code, a lot of in the support, people who support the martial law. It was not very gendered language. People were talking about the duty of all citizens to support. Some small minority of them would mention the duty of men, but it was much less gendered than I expected. And there was much more of a push across all these buckets of answers to think in terms of a gender neutral approach. So even those who supported the martial law might say, well, you should be conscripting the young women too. So I think that there's, it was heartening to me, sort of as a human rights scholar and a gender scholar, to see how much that's changing, even in the context of war. And I think that I'm not personally connected to anyone in the Ukrainian President's Office or Ministry of Defense, so I don't really know how they're thinking about this. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if Zelensky were completely open to hearing good reasons to reconsider this law, but he hasn't. The reason I say it wouldn't surprise me is that he has been open, and he's been, I think that the desire to be a good citizen in Europe is really genuine. And so usually when someone nudges him on something, he will respond. They at the start of the war were sending around all those YouTube videos of the Russian prisoners, and human rights NGOs said, actually, that's not okay. And so they were like, oh. And and this is exactly how human rights should work. You shouldn't need a huge naming and shaming campaign, because really sometimes all you need is a nudge. One of the things I think scholars like me and Kelly and others can do more of is look at how human rights advocacy works beyond the naming and shaming campaigns, because I think there's an enormous range there's a repertoire of action that we don't focus on as much because it's harder to see. The naming and shaming is so public. But I think probably a lot of the power of human rights has to do with what's going on in people's social networks, what's going on behind doors. That might be part of how we crack this puzzle of limiting the weaponization of the naming and shaming. Anyway, I have so many more thoughts, but we'll talk again in the mingle.
I'm Clifford Bob from Duquesne. My question is sort of related to an answer you gave a few minutes ago about the ICC and the fact that the Democratic administration seems somewhat more favorable, Republicans maybe not so much. But it seems to get to a broader issue of partisan and partisan differences about what human rights mean. And the broad terms of human rights are so vague that different groups, when it comes down to specific issues, are going to actually come into conflict with one another.
Mhm.
And it seems that many of the human rights organizations that we tend to focus on would be more along the lines of let's say what the Democratic administrations would want here in the United States, and not so much what Republican administrations would want. But the bigger question I have is really how you can talk about this broad concept without getting into very specific policy enactments, because it seems that a whole broad range of things, even diametrically opposed things, could be considered human rights under the broad terms of the ICCPR and so forth. And then related to that is just a question, or this is more a comment, and I think a correction to something you said, that may in fact show the difficulties of sort of getting out of the partisan blinders that we all have. You said that the Ukraine war was the first major aggressive land war in 70 years. But what do you think about the Iraq war, or even Afghanistan, or our attacks on Syria and so forth? There seems like there's dozens, if not more, that the US alone has been involved in, and probably many more by other countries as well, but we know the US best. So I think it's worth perhaps correcting that, or maybe that's part of, you clearly have strong opinions about the Ukraine war. This suggests how difficult it is to sort of take that out of your thinking.
Sure. I'm glad you pointed that out. I thought I had said in Europe, but those were, okay, I guess it depends on how you look at it. Those were civil wars in which there was an intervention. Depends on how you look at it. I think that this is a war for territorial aggrandizement, which is not the case in most of the interstate wars that we've seen since the UN Charter was established. And so I think it makes it different. But that's an academic conversation. But yeah, so your bigger point is about partisanship is really, really interesting. You're right. It's one of the things I like about your book is that you show us how diverse the use of the term human rights is. I think as a scholar, the most interesting cases to look at, depending on what question you're asking, are the ones where the definition of the issue is contested precisely because you have participants on two sides making different kinds of rights claims. And then how does an organization like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty come down on a debate like that? Often they come down with not taking a side, not getting involved. But sometimes they get involved, and how do they make that determination? I think that is such an interesting and political process right there. Sort of what gains a foothold with the human rights elites, and are there other human rights elites that we should be studying that are clashing, which is where your work has done, created some really strong inroads for younger scholars to pick up on. So I don't know if I'm giving you a very satisfactory answer, except that I'm really happy you asked that question, both of those questions.
Thank you, Charli.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming, and to our online audience as well. Tomorrow morning, we'll start again at 9 o'clock. We have a great program. We'll hear again from everybody you heard from today in a different format, under slightly somewhat different conditions. And so please join us at 9 o'clock. It'll run till around this time. And for those live, we will have also breakfast here at 8:30. So please join us at 8:30. But now let's move into the reception area where you could spend some time, and then we'll close. Thank you very much.
Thank you.